Hey y'all. Hello,
Hi,
Summer.
how are you?
I'm hanging in there. We got hair compliments. I don't know who that was aimed at, but I think we should.
I do love your blue hair, I have to
it,
say.
it is needing a cut.
I like how it's grown out though. It looks really good.
Yeah, it's kind of fun. It's fun to see how
Yeah.
how it keeps changing. Hi everybody. Maybe we'll give people another minute or so. Oh, it was there you go. It was a hair compliment for both of us. So your hair is looking very. I'm very jealous of how well conditioned it looks. I feel
Yeah,
like
a struggle, and I have to, because I don't go anywhere really right now, I have to convince myself to do it. Um, so I'm glad to have a reason today.
so for those of you who are joining in, we'll give a couple minutes. But I've pinned our little comment. We're doing our kind of weekly slow look live, settling into weekend mode. Um, and our guest this week, coming to us from the West Coast, is Summer Sloane-Britt. And I maybe we'll give people a couple, like another minute or so to log in, and then thanks, Miles. It has been a while since my last professional haircut, so I'm still hanging in there. Um, but let's give people. I love that this is turning into hair chat as we wait for people to log.
I think it's very
Um,
nice.
oh, I'm sorry, your shampoo did not arrive.
Oh no,
I do like a curly hair specific shampoo.
it's a necessity.
Um, okay, well, I mean, maybe why don't we? It is a couple minutes after. I know you've for those of you who tuned in early, you got a little bit of hair care tips, hair code, which wasn't really what our plan was, but
That's okay.
it's so. But Summer, maybe I thought you can kind of introduce yourself. I mean, Summer is a PhD student at the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU, but currently based in LA. And maybe if do you want to start off by just kind of talking about your work or where you're at in the PhD academia journey?
Sure. Um, so in my PhD program, I have one more semester of coursework, and then I have my exams, which I'm looking forward to. They're very stressful, but I look forward to them. And I've been working recently and, setting up for kind of long-term work on the photography projects of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Um, and because I think one of my first introductions to photography and its relationship to Blackness was civil rights photography, and I think that's pretty normal to happen. But SNCC was always kind of treated as an appendage to that, and not given its kind of full due, I think, as both, an organizing group and as photographers, particularly in art history, because often it gets kind of siloed into civil rights photography, gets siloed into photojournalism, and I was interested on the aesthetic choices that they were making and thinking about those in tandem with each other. And so that's how I ended up kind of there. And I also ended up thinking about that too because of research that I've done about the South and kind of art and its relationships to the South, which is something else that's really under-researched and undervalued in art history. Um, so thinking about place and space came from architecture, and then thinking about photography came from that history in my work. So it's cool to be able to merge those two together.
Well, and I think that's also it's like one of the things. I mean, I have not done a PhD in anything. I did a master's in art history, but I think just being able to do that, kind of reconsidering something that you may already be familiar with, but looking at it from a different lens or kind of in a different context is interesting. Because I agree, it's like, I feel like certainly the way I have encountered a lot of civil rights photography is that photojournalism style that you mentioned, but to give it a kind of aesthetic and art historical examination is like deepening the engagement.
Yeah, and it's really enjoyable just to, learn about what people were doing and how things were different and similar, and also find these strange connections between the different things that I do work on and not even realizing them. Like one of the photographers who worked with Snick passed away this week, Matt Herron, which is really sad. But one of the things that I got in kind of email messages, because I feel like now everyone who gets any email about Snick, they send it to me. But another photographer that I've done work on, Dorothea Lange, actually mentored him, and there's communication between Snick and Dorothea Lange, and mutual respect, and a lot of the Snick photographers finding inspiration in the work she did in the 30s.
That's interesting.
And I was like, that's so weird. I was just writing about Dorothea Lange.
Well, and that these waves of, because like you said, she was like working in the 30s and kind of in the Depression and the Dust Bowl, and kind of then there's like this next big, the civil rights kind of wave of social protest and social uprising. I feel like we're now kind of in another moment of that. Not that those have been the only moments throughout history, but it is interesting to see those echoes.
Yeah, it's really cool, and it's just, I don't know, I knew that there were connections between Snick and other photographers, like Richard Avedon, and photographers who sent them equipment and things like that. But I didn't know about that Lang connection. And it, I think speaks to how they were very invested in looking at photography and not just kind of using these things as, tactical tools, which they still were. Multiple things can be true about what they were doing. And they just haven't, gotten their fair spotlight put on them.
Until now.
Yeah.
Do it. Well, and I wonder how, I mean, I know like we've talked a little bit in the lead up to this conversation too about how kind of in the current moment of like pandemic and also Black Lives Matter, kind of social justice uprisings and protests, like that the work that you're doing, obviously, which you started before the pandemic and before the current rise of, I mean, obviously the Black Lives Matter movement has been around for a while, but how it may resonate differently now, I guess, to be working in that kind of on that topic or in that space. I mean, have you found that you're thinking about it differently now, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because I feel like part of what I was working on before this was how photography historians write about photography in the global South could be really helpful for writing about the U.S. South and thinking about aesthetics there. But what's more interesting beyond like methods of like how to approach writing about these was that I was talking to a friend earlier in the pandemic about how now the kind of work that we were doing before has become like of bodily importance to us, because it's always been important to us from our position as Black people who do research and work in history. But it feels as if doing a different project would actually be wrong, even for like your body. And I think that feeling came before the protests, but I think the protests really amplified them in some ways. And just, I talk to friends about public schools and how public universities should be the norm, and like that, and how those beliefs for him were solidified even more, just seeing all of the disastrous things that have happened the past 6 months.
I feel like that it's like I keep talking to people about how everything seems to resonate differently in this pandemic, especially, leaving like the protests are kind of like an additional layer on top of that, but that sense of everything being more visceral or more bodily, like feel more kind of deeply important when you see some of these systems not working out.
Yeah, interesting, like you go through the disillusionment with these spaces you want to have worked in, and then this happens, and it's not even disillusionment anymore. It's just like deep set disappointments, or like reaffirming of those disappointments and disillusionments, and
Yeah.
figuring what to do with all of that can be really hard.
Well, but that it also sounds like for you, it's kind of given you like an additional layer of investment in the importance of the research and the writing and the work that you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it took a while for me to come back to art history after undergrad, just because when I started undergrad, I wanted to do art history. But because it was so focused on kind of white and men and all these things, I really drifted away and went towards anthropology, both visual and museum anthropology. And that was how I discovered the ways in which I wanted to engage with art. And I think sometimes I struggle with thinking a lot about how feeling my work is art historical, but it's attached to so many other things too. That like feeling confident in doing that kind of work takes time.
Yeah.
And also recognizing that, I don't want other people to feel that way too. Or feel like the things that they study are just tangential or not central to what is really important. Which I think everyone's kind of grappling with, even in our graduate school department, people are struggling with how to, find validity in the work that they do, and have professors, people with authority back them up, and also have your back in what you study. That doesn't happen very often, which is an issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's also, it's like this confluence of all of these layers where it's sort of like you need to have that confidence in yourself, right? Especially as you go further into academia and you get to kind of this PhD level where you're finding this topic that, you may well be the first person to be digging into something as deeply, or to be finding a certain archive or making certain connections. Like, you've got to have that confidence in yourself, but that has to be supported by the people around you and the institution that you're working in.
Yeah. And it was fascinating especially in moving to New York, um, and realizing that people that I really admire, like Deborah Willis, for example, who's at NYU, and was one of the first people ever to write about Black photographers in a substantive way, still struggling with some of the things that I struggle with. And like seeing people in these positions of power, from my perception, still having to go through kind of systematic issues and navigate them, and also just seeing people as people. But
Yeah,
yeah.
you're like when your academic heroes become the people that you're just talking to in the course of your work. I mean, do you feel like, so I also want to talk about the kind of like relocation piece, because
Yeah.
you are in LA right now, right? But are doing your work through this program at the IFA and NYU, which is based in New York City, obviously. And I'm kind of curious how that, like, when you weren't in those offices physically with all these people, like when the pandemic kind of shut everything down and
Yeah.
there wasn't, I don't know if it's like water cooler talk or like lounge talk or classroom, like physical sharing of space. Um, how did that, I don't know, how did that affect kind of those relationships that you were having, or those conversations you were having with those peers?
I mean, I think naturally those conversations disappearing was really difficult, and still is really difficult, just because I feel lucky to have met people in my program that I really enjoy and really enjoy talking to, and know different things than I do, and really, it becomes those conversations where you end up kind of giving pieces to others, and others giving pieces to you hadn't necessarily thought about before. Not having that is really hard, and keeping track of people can be hard. Like, there are definitely weeks during the pandemic where I didn't talk to anyone, which didn't help at all. Um, and realizing that staying in touch with people is really important. Um, but relocating to LA was definitely, I'm glad that I did it. But it was hard because my partner and I were working on a house the whole time for 4 months. So it was like doing classes and research while construction was happening, which was nice to have a physical thing to do that wasn't schoolwork. But I ended up having to like do some of my classes in the garage and things like that, which wasn't anticipated. And I think that for the upcoming semester, it feels very anticlimactic because it's my last semester of coursework probably ever, and it will be on my computer. But those relationships are still there, and I really value them. And I know that not everyone in PhD programs are so lucky to meet so many wonderful people and support each other in those ways. So even from afar, I feel very lucky to have those things. Yeah.
It is funny. It's like that anticlimax of like one semester of coursework left, and it is. But I feel like honestly, even since we first talked, it's like different schools have made their decisions about whether they're going back in person or virtually or some combination of the two. I
Yeah.
actually followed, what is NYU all virtual? Like,
So NYU hasn't gone to virtual entirely yet, but I suspect that they will, especially because I think today Columbia announced that they'll be all virtual, and maybe last week Penn announced that too. And I think it should have been the conversation at the beginning of this summer, because now it's like students were coming in 2 weeks. And I think that is, speaks to the business model that schools are functioning on. But I'm glad that, if those are the choices that schools are making, I'm glad because it's for people's safety, not just students, but people who work at schools too.
yeah.
Yeah, it's very.
Well, and that I feel like that business model idea, and even the fact like all of these institutions are waiting for someone else to make the first decision. It's like, oh, okay, well, Columbia decided this or Penn decided this. Like these kind of like elite higher ed institutions, not necessarily
Mhm.
knowing where to go either. It kind of draws attention to the fact that these business models are not. I mean, not that anybody was like quite ready to a situation. I'm not trying to, throw them under the bus, but it is really interesting to see how last minute some of these decisions are.
Absolutely. And, to see what are the first thoughts rather than kind of the desperate thoughts, because it's, the first thought should be what is the best for the safety of students rather than how can we ensure that we'll be back in person and back to normal or whatever, as soon as possible, because it ends up being, it doesn't allow people to emotionally prepare. And that's something I've talked to my mom about a lot too, is like she lives in Philadelphia, and she is talking now about emotionally preparing for the winter and like not really going anywhere in the winter. And what are the alternatives to walking for 2 hours a day? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I do feel like it's sort of this like massive collective unknown. And like, sure, I think I've been feeling very grateful for things like technology, where we can connect and talk in this way, even if we're not able to meet in person. But
Mhm.
it's it's not a one-to-one substitute.
No, it's true. And it's what I remember we had talked about. There was a week where I watched 17 movies and was just like detaching from this reality through this medium that I really love and kind of grappling with, is this work or is this not work? And trying to, shed at least for part of the summer that obsession with productivity, which I think I also struggle with too, just in the work that I focus on, of feeling like owing people who have done all this labor that hasn't been recognized, doing them justice, but it doesn't have to be right now. Like at this moment, like today, like before noon, I don't have to write this thing.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
and work processes, yeah.
and then sometimes it's like watching 17 movies in a week is like what your brain may need to give it so that the next week you can go back to writing or researching or focusing in a different way.
Yeah, definitely. And I love movies, and it's funny. because in a bunch of the movies that I watched, photography came up. It was interesting. It was like photography or people thinking about place came up. And I was like, see, this is why I'm watching these movies.
See, you never know where the spark will spark will come. I mean, do you feel like you said LA, like you were glad that you had relocated to LA, even though it was kind of like putting you in a very different context, but do you feel like that's like you've been watching movies or have you been able to do things in LA that have helped you kind of cope through
Mhm.
this last 6 months, whatever it's been?
Yeah, I am. I mean, I know people, especially people my age, are very much, partially, at least some people, are invested in still hanging out in certain kinds of ways that stress me out. Um, because I think both my parents are very kind of borderline germophobic people, which means that I'm borderline germophobic people. Uh, but being able to go out to the desert has been really nice, or to secluded beaches has been really nice. And being able to be outside just in general is nice, because even if it's hot here, it's not as humid.
Right.
So in those ways, doing things around LA has been really helpful. It's interesting trying to get to know a new city when you can't go anywhere or experience it the way you like to experience a city. But it's so different from New York. And we had talked about when there was a moment in time during the pandemic where I had this deep nostalgia for my life in New York, and feeling very frustrated that it wasn't what it was right now, um, which contrasted how I felt while living that life, where it's like there were very specific things that I really loved, for the most part, people and friends and things like that in my work, and then a lot of things that I didn't like, especially in like the art world and museum world. But it was weird having to go through these feelings of like, I miss this. Like, is this actually what I want? And having to circle back to, no, you're just nostalgic. And now living in a place that you have no nostalgia for because you have virtually no memories here.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's sort of like, I mean, who knows how long you will be in LA or if and when you will end up back in New York, but that would be interesting to kind of note, like if it was sort of this little bubble of LA time during the pandemic, that like that's a very particular way of getting to know a place.
Yeah, it is. It definitely is. And
I
I,
also,
go ahead.
uh, no, I was just going to say, I also feel that same way. So I moved out to Aspen in February, so a little bit before the pandemic, but also was coming from New York. And I am glad not to be in New York, but the things I have had the similar thoughts where it's like the things that I do miss about my life there are not happening. You
Yeah,
know, like you can't go to museums, you can't go to the theater, you can't see people
yeah,
in this.
yeah,
It is
it's true.
nostalgia for a thing that's not occurring.
I know, and it's weird to not. It is weird not to be in it right now, uh,
Mhm.
and kind of be able to detach those memories from what might feel like the reality. And even if you intellectually know that it's not the reality, it still feels like that's the reality of, yeah, I would be going to the farmer's market right now, and then like to the movies or like the museum or something, and then to a dinner, and it's like that's not what's happening.
But it is also, I guess, a kind of like placelessness
Yeah,
where it's like the it's like you're both in a place where you can't get to know LA in the way that you normally would.
yeah,
Also, the life that you were familiar with in New York City wouldn't be happening. So,
absolutely. And I felt lucky because two of my friends got married last week, and they had a very organized wedding that was very small, and everyone had to be tested and things like that. And it was funny because being there, we were all like, this is the first time I've been around this many people since like March. Um, and it was very strange. And I was like, I'm hearing voices of conversations that I'm not attached to, and like being out in this way and missing that, but being really happy to have had at least one event this summer that was outside and celebratory.
And I do think there's something, I think that's come up in like a lot of ways in our conversation, but there's something nice about that idea of like people finding ways through this. It's like, you know, okay, so we're facing a lot of challenges and many people facing greater challenges certainly than I am. I will only speak for me, but it's the, you know, it's like that they still went ahead with this. They figured out how to make sure everyone got tested. They had it as a smaller group and you were able to gather. As opposed to everything just having to be indefinitely postponed. Because I do think, you know, you bring up that idea of like getting back to normal. It's
What is that?
like we may not be going back to, and that what normal was may not be something that actually we want to be.
Yeah. And I think that's the biggest thing, right? That's my biggest problem with the attempts to get back to normal is like that was not working either. Like this isn't working, but that was definitely not working at all. And it's like we finally have this space that's really horrible and just really terrible things are happening, but has a lot of potential for rethinking a lot of things. And I just want more people to be engaging with like how can these things be different and imagined differently in all different kinds of jobs, you know.
Yeah. Well, it was also, I remember you saying in one of our earlier conversations too, that growing up in Philly, there was much more of this kind of like grassroots, like neighborhood kind of community activism tradition that you had seen in New York in the same way. I mean, I feel like LA, we have to put an asterisk with it because you know you're there during pandemic time. But I think that's also there's something interesting in that too about there being like either city specific or region specific like ways of coming together or ways of making it through adversity.
Absolutely. Like, because in Philly, there are, I think, about 300 neighborhood based cultural institutions, which is a huge amount. Um, and the majority of them are embedded in actual neighborhoods. So going from that and then to New York, where the art world felt very business-like in a different kind of way, was really jarring for me. And something that I don't think I fully reconciled at any point while I was in New York. And even talking to kind of New York natives and people who grew up in New York and the differences between art access in New York versus Philadelphia being really different, while New York is kind of built up as the pinnacle of the art world, kind of always being skeptical of that, but then having to live in it was really just stressful because I just was like, I miss doing art with like a bunch of teenagers in a specific neighborhood, not doing, you know, walking through museums and engaging with museum administrations in New York that were very stressful to me and felt like not the point of art also.
Yeah, it's like adding kind of layers between the direct experience and
Absolutely.
as the participant.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the thing that's really insidious about museums and particular art worlds is that they also function under these kind of conditions of gaslighting people, where it's like we are including non-white artists in substantive ways, and then if you realize like, yeah, but really, you're not actually really three-dimensionally engaging with that practice. Or where people are from, but rather trying to fold people into pre-existing kind of narratives and thought processes, which I find that not helpful in a lot of ways. And if it is helpful to some people, I think that's really beneficial. But, you know, it requires asking the questions of like, well, why is it that, you know, 93% of museum audiences are white? I mean, that's something. Yeah.
Well, and then I think it's been interesting seeing how many museums and I guess higher learning institutions as well are it's like I was joking with someone the other day that it's like the era of the open letter, that so many people are coming together in this kind of more grassroots way, you know, like voices are being
Mm-hmm.
given new platforms, I guess, to bring up some of those issues more blatantly and to say like, well, we don't want to go back to the way things were. Like some of those things that you were bringing up, it's like, well, why are things categorized into different curatorial departments this way? Or why are museum audiences so white? Why are museum staffs so white? I mean, you know, here she sits as a white person working in a museum. You know? I think that's been an interesting thing that's come out of this period of time is more vocal questioning of that on a wider scale rather than just it being a one-off conversation between a couple of people.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, there's room for a lot of things to change. But, simultaneously, it's possible that, these institutions still refuse to change. And I mean, I think that's why it's so important to have those community-based things too. Because it's like, I mean, Philadelphia has museums and it has like the Barnes and the PMA and things like that. But it just feels more balanced out because it's, these different things are also accessible. And, the hope is that that will happen in New York, but I don't know if that's true. And I mean, even before this, finding the most interesting art things being not in New York, and being in smaller museums and museums that are, more readily attempting to try new things and new ways of existing and being. It's just, I don't know, you want to be optimistic, but it's hard to kind of shed those cynicisms that have been built up.
Yeah. I'm right there with you. I mean, as somebody who has worked in museums a long time, and I love many things about museums, but that doesn't keep me from also feeling like I have plenty of critiques and that I would like to see change about how museums operate. And maybe that, I think there is that thing about like smaller organizations and more community-based organizations being more nimble and being able to, kind of observe and listen to what people in their neighborhoods want and need from them and pivot and change quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've seen in this time, certainly, it's like the quicker you can pivot,
the better.
For giant, these like giant bureaucratic institutions, whether it's a, museum or university that are like planning things so far out and relying on certain kinds of revenue and visitorship or tuition or
Absolutely.
yeah. I know. I feel like I'm really trying hard these days not to artificially force conclusions that are like too cynical or too optimistic. That it is both those things just existing.
Yeah, and it's hard not to, especially with I think museums for me, because I mean schools I definitely am very firm in this is not how this should function. And in museums, I think because I just have worked in different capacities in museums, have this kind of, tendency to try and like nuance things, right? Of like, well, I know now more how museum budgets work and how terrible they work, and like how it took so long to get to these models and how long it will take to undo those models, and is it even possible to undo them at this point? But I really don't think so, just because of how large operating budgets, for example, are, which is why, I feel resistance to ideas like decolonizing museums, because museums are colonial institutions, like they wouldn't exist without colonialism. And, I fall under the realm more of like museums shouldn't exist. And like, what is something that can exist where it has maybe the ethos of museums, but is not this exact model, because this model is really harmful to audiences and artists, who I think are the most centrally important groups involved in museums, especially art museums. And how do we, create something totally different, that doesn't also replicate these issues, because
Right.
there are organizations that try and do something really different and end up just replicating these same kind of money models or models of functioning and thinking or exhibitions, that is just as harmful to me as museums are. Yeah.
And it's hard. And I think this is a moment like the pandemic and social justice protests and this moment where I think we're seeing some examples of people trying to come up with alternative models of how to go about whatever they're going about. But I'm also just struck by how difficult it is to reinvent a new model when there isn't a pattern. I mean, that's by definition, obviously, if you're coming up with something new, there's no example to follow.
Yeah.
Um, and how hard that's
Hmm.
going to be for so many people. And I too am hopeful that there will be new models that come this time
Yeah.
that don't repeat some of those same harmful things. Um, and that maybe I don't know. Sometimes I feel like on any given day, I'm with you about like I don't know that museums will ever change, and then there are other times where I feel like I really want to be somebody working from the inside the museum to make
Mhm.
those changes. And
Yeah.
on how I wake up and what the news is that day, and
Yeah. Definitely probably one of the most jarring things about quarantine is, being kind of forced to sit with your emotions in a different kind of way because there's no outlet. And I was talking to someone about this of like missing dancing and like going out and dancing. And I think a lot of people associate that with missing like partying, for example. But it's a different kind of thing. Where like going out and dancing in the history of like clubs and DJs and things like that actually come from, needing spaces of release, and associating those closer to something like church or like religion rather than just partying as a generalization. But like missing being in a very hot space with a lot of people listening to this music, like I miss that.
yeah, I have been thinking about the same thing where like going to see live music or live theater, or it's like that idea of being in a room with a whole group of people all there for that same purpose, and you're having this communal experience. And the ritual of that, it's whatever the music may be, or the theater may be, or the DJ may be playing. It's like it's ritual and the communal feel that,
Yeah, and it's hard to find that right now.
yeah. And Zoom doesn't
It doesn't satisfy the same urges.
a bunch of little windows of people dancing on Zoom is also lovely. And I have done some of that myself, but it is not the same as in a hot room with the bass pounding.
True.
Yeah.
And it's, my one of my friend's grandfather, who I have like a pretty close relationship to, sent me an article just about grief right now and how there's so much that there is to grieve at the moment. But it's hard to grieve when you're still in something, especially when it's like you don't know when it's going to end.
Yeah.
Or not fully knowing what you're there to grieve about or how to do it. So it's also worrisome even when, quarantine is over or COVID is quote unquote over, whatever that looks like, because none of us knows what it will look like. Having to then, go through a grieving process
Yeah.
will be really hard.
And for all of the, whether that looks like, a vaccine or the disease fades out, or I don't know what it will look like, but um, all of the ramifications that are happening in people's lives now around, evictions and layoffs and, the kind of economic fallout, as well as the health fallout. Like those will not be fixed immediately upon, production of a vaccine, for example.
It's really true. And I think that's what gives urgency to, at least some people that I know, the work that they do, and contributes to that bodily experience. And I think that's part of what the bodily reaction is too, of like realizing in this very tangible way how your body can move through the world and how it can be thrown off so easily by a virus, which makes, the things that you might have known in your mind true more of something that you know in your body in a different kind of way, or at least thinking about it in relation to your body in a different kind of way. And I went to a bookstore for the first time, like last week, and I found like a book of one of the snake photographers there.
Oh my God, it was there waiting for you.
Yeah.
But did that feel more special because it was like venturing out into a physical space?
Yeah, it was very strange because like I love bookstores and going to them, um, and hadn't been in one for so long. Um, and like that being, the book that I found that day was really nice. And it just feels like there are kind of spiritual things happening right now in different ways for a lot of people. And being surprised to find this book, but also not surprised. Yeah, it's really nice.
Well, maybe that's kind of like a nice note to end on, that it's like new rituals maybe coming out of this, or like finding significance in new things that is not what we're used to, but is like, I don't know, silver lining feels too optimistic. I don't want to be using that phrase. Cosmic validation of the path. There you go. That's a really nice way of putting it. um, but yeah, I mean, I feel like that's something maybe to just like leave everybody with, or maybe I will be leaving with this myself, is like, what are the kind of things we can be looking for in the changes that are ongoing and the uncertainties that are ongoing, but like these new rituals, or new like ways of kind of embodying our feelings. Or we're getting
Yeah,
very philosophical now, but that's kind of where my mind is on.
yeah, and thinking about what you do differently. You know,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I guess in the meantime, I'm still gonna wish you kind of like all of the fun and joy to get outside in LA with more space, even
Yeah.
if it's just kind of a strange time to be in the city.
Yeah, it's strange, but it's nice to be able to go to all these different places that are outside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe we can wrap up there, and I will wish anybody watching a happy weekend. I will wish you a happy weekend, Summer. And hopefully at some point we can meet in person and not just
Do a phone or a computer.
all of the people that I've been talking to for this series are now people that I hope to be able to meet with in person.
I do too.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us. It was
Thank
lovely
you
to
for
see
this is so
you. Yeah.
nice.
And thanks for all of you folks who've joined in and watched. And I will say goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.